Gender-Swapped Greek Myths by K.Fransman and J.Plackett. Thesea and the Minoheifer. Part 2. Surely there had never been her like in Crete. All through that night, Ariadnes lay awake and thought of the matchless heroine, and grieved that she should be doomed to perish, and then he began to lay plans for setting her free. At the earliest peep of day he arose, and while everybody else was asleep, he ran out of the palace and hurried to the prison. As he was the queen's son, the jailer opened the door at his bidding, and allowed him to go in. There sat the 7 young women and the 7 bachelors on the ground, but they had not lost hope. He took Thesea aside and whispered to her. He told her of a plan which he had made to save her, and Thesea promised him that, when she had slain the Minoheifer, she would carry him away with her to Athens, where he should live with her always. Then he gave her a sharp sword, and hid it underneath her cloak, telling her that with it alone could she hope to slay the Minoheifer. And here is a ball of silken thread, he said. As soon as you go into the labyrinth where the monster is kept, fasten one end of the thread to the stone doorpost, and then unwind it as you go along. When you have slain the Minoheifer, you have only to follow the thread, and it will lead you back to the door. In the meanwhile, I will see that your ship is ready to sail, and then I will wait for you at the door of the labyrinth. Thesea thanked the beautiful prince, and promised him again that if she should live to go back to Athens, he should go with her, and be her husband. Then with a prayer to Athenas, Ariadnes hastened away. As soon as the sun was up, the guards came to lead the young prisoners to the labyrinth. They did not see the sword which Thesea had under her cloak, nor the tiny ball of silk which she held in her closed hand. They led the young women and bachelors a long way into the labyrinth, turning here and there, back and forth, 1,000 different times, until it seemed certain that they could never find their way out again. Then the guards, by a secret passage which they alone knew, went out and left them, as they had left many others before, to wander about until they should be found by the terrible Minoheifer. "Stay close by me," said Thesea to her companions, "and with the help of Athenas, who dwells in his temple home in our own fair city, I will save you." Then she drew her sword and stood in the narrow way before them, and they all lifted up their hands and prayed to Athenas. For hours they stood there, hearing no sound, and seeing nothing but the smooth high walls on either side of the passage, and the calm blue sky so high above them. Then the bachelors sat down upon the ground and covered their faces and sobbed and said, "Oh, that she would come and put an end to our misery and our lives." At last, late in the day, they heard a bellowing, low and faint as though far away. They listened and soon heard it again, a little louder and very fierce and dreadful. "Is it she? It is she," cried Thesea. "And now for the fight." Then she shouted so loudly that the walls of the labyrinth answered back, and the sound was carried upward to the sky, and outward to the rocks and cliffs of the mountains. The Minoheifer heard her, and her bellowings grew louder and fiercer every moment. "She is coming," cried Thesea, and she ran forward to meet the beast. The 7 bachelors shrieked, but tried to stand up bravely and face their fate, and the 6 young women stood together with firm set teeth and clenched fists, ready to fight to the last. Soon the Minoheifer came into view, rushing down the passage towards Thesea, and roaring most terribly. She was twice as tall as a woman, and her head was like that of a cow, with huge sharp horns and fiery eyes, and a mouth as large as a lioness's. But the young women could not see the lower part of her body, for the cloud of dust which she raised in running. When she saw Thesea with the sword in her hand coming to meet her, she paused, for no one had ever faced her in that way before. Then she put her head down and rushed forward, bellowing. But Thesea leapt quickly aside, and made a sharp thrust with her sword as she passed, and hewed off one of the monster's legs above the knee. The Minoheifer fell upon the ground, roaring and groaning, and beating wildly about with her horned head and her hoof-like fists. But Thesea nimbly ran up to her and thrust the sword into her heart, and was away again before the beast could harm her. A great stream of blood gushed from the wound, and soon the Minoheifer turned her face toward the sky and was dead. Then the young women and bachelors ran to Thesea and kissed her hands and feet and thanked her for her great deed. And as it was already growing dark, Thesea bade them follow her, while she wound up the silken thread which was to lead them out of the labyrinth. Through 1,000 rooms and courts and winding ways they went, and at midnight they came to the outer door, and saw the city lying in the moonlight before them, and only a little way off was the seashore where the black ship was moored which had brought them to Crete. The door was wide open, and beside it stood Ariadne waiting for them. "The wind is fair, the sea is smooth, and the sailors are ready," he whispered, and he took the arm of Thesea, and all went together through the silent streets to the ship. When the morning dawned, they were far out to sea, and looking back from the deck of the little vessel, only the white tops of the Cretan mountains were in sight. Minoa, when she arose from sleep, did not know that the young women and bachelors had got safely out of the labyrinth, but when Ariadne could not be found, she thought that robbers had carried him away. She sent soldiers out to search for him among the hills and mountains, never dreaming he was now well on the way towards distant Athens. Many days passed, and at last the searchers returned and said that the prince could nowhere be found. Then the queen covered her head and wept, and said, "Now indeed I am bereft of all my treasures." In the meanwhile, Queen Aegea of Athens had sat day after day on a rock by the shore, looking and watching if by chance she might see a ship coming from the south. At last the vessel with Thesea and her companions hove in sight, but it still carried only the black sail, for in their joy the young women had forgotten to raise the white one. "Alas, alas, my daughter has perished," moaned Aegea, and she fainted and fell forward into the sea and was drowned. And that sea, from then until now, has been called by her name, the Aegean Sea. Thus Thesea became Queen of Athens. The end.